as a mother, you can change the composition of your breast milk, the types of bacteria species that you give into your baby, the types of HMOs that are feeding the bacteria in your child's gut, which then shapes the gut microbiome and blocks pathogens. And it also changes the fatty acid composition of your breast milk, which is building your child. Why isn't anyone talking about this? What a mother eats impacts the composition of her breast milk, and it impacts a number of variables, such as the bacteria composition, so the microbiome composition of the breast milk that's being delivered to the baby. It also impacts the composition of HMOs, human milk oligosaccharides, and these are like prebiotics, non-digestible carbohydrates that are vital for forming the baby's microbiome. And they also help like protect against pathogens. And then also the fatty acid composition of the mother's diet impacts the fatty acid composition of her breast milk. So clearly it's playing a huge role in shaping a child's health from the start.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that it's in terms of nutrition and stuff for pregnant women and mothers, that's talked about. But a lot of the messaging is still around what mainstream is, which is a lot of not necessarily vegetable oils, but PUFAs are superior to saturated fats, more nuts, more seeds, more salmon, more avocado, less butter, less grass-fed meat, etc. So there is a discussion on health, but it's not really, what we're bringing up here today is more about how that information could actually be harmful and what we really should be focusing on. So personally, for me, this is so relevant because I obviously have said in our other podcast, but I hope to become a mother soon within the next year or two. And I think what was most astounding from what we've learned through these studies, what we're going to be talking about today, is that it's not just about what you eat when you're pregnant. It's about what you've been eating the years prior. And, we've known that. We've known that your fatty acid profile takes a significant amount of time to slowly switch over if you're going from a high PUFA diet to a more saturated fat diet and vice versa. So anybody who's thinking about having kids in the next few years, anybody who's, in the process of being pregnant or breastfeeding, this is going to be super impactful for you too. Is definitely so alarming for me. So I'm
Like
excited to dive in.
someone may be like, where is this conversation coming from? Why are they talking about this? Sarah and Brandon want to have kids very soon. I want to one day have kids. It's not yet my time. Still need to find the important part of it, which is a man, but we're not experts. Like, we just need to come out and say that right away. We are not experts in human breast milk, but why aren't people talking about these things? And diving into the literature, there's a lot of these variables that aren't well researched. Like, there's not enough research studies demonstrating the implications that these things have on children. Because at the end of the day, our understanding of nutrition, human metabolism, and how the body works is really still at its infancy. And there's so much more left that we have to learn about it. And we'll go over some of these things, but why aren't these things talked about? And unfortunately, I really think it goes back to like pharmaceutical drugs, because you read into a lot of this and it brings up genetics. It brings up, oh, your genetics impact this. But why don't people bring up that you can change your genetic expression? You can change your genes by your environment, your diet, your lifestyle very quickly. Of course, there's some things that are epigenetic and like do play a role 100%, but you can't blame your genes on everything. And that's what the pharmaceutical industries want you to do, because then you're left in this like victim mindset of like, oh, it's not me, it's my genes. And so therefore I need these pills. I have to rely on them. So I think that that's an important like mindset and framework that a lot of mainstream operates on. And instead, why aren't we talking about how empowering this can be? Because you can change the composition of these things. So that's how I view it. And again, many people may say like, you're not a mother, you don't know what you're talking about. I don't. But looking into the literature was just an alarming wake up for me.
Yeah. So, I mean, another reason that this stuff might not be talked about is because infant formula is obviously a huge product that's
Yeah.
sold. And I know it's life saving for some people, especially who just maybe are incapable of producing enough breast milk. So, not saying infant formula is horrible or the worst thing. Obviously, it's necessary in some scenarios. But I think, again, what we're going to be talking about today is we know that most infant formulas are high in vegetable oils. So, they're high in PUFAs, and why that is alarming for the child. And so, yeah, I mean,
Let's start with HMOs.
well, yeah. So, like you said, um, breastfeeding is known as the gold standard for feeding an infant.
Generations.
Yeah. And I think that that's becoming more and more recognized again today. Like, I think a lot of people are trying to move away from formula unless necessary. And even maybe there's better formula options coming out, but we're just focusing on breast milk today. So, breast milk is important for the gut health, the immune system development, and just overall entire physiological development. So, you wanted to talk specifically about the gut health. Do you want to dive into that?
Yeah. There's like your mother's gut microbiome is almost like imprinted on the child because there's like an axis, which means like, information and particles and compounds are transferred between the mother and the child, and that your gut microbiome as a mother impacts the microbiome of your breast milk. So, we go back to raw milk versus pasteurized milk. Well, human breast milk is literally raw milk that the mother is delivering to the child. And raw milk means there are living microorganisms in it. And those microorganisms help shape the baby's gut microbiome. And so something that I found was interesting is there actually is quite a bit of research showing that a mother's gut microbiome can then impact the child's gut microbiome. So if a mother is in a state of poor gut health, that will have some sort of implication on the child. Where the research is kind of lacking is like what that means for the child, because we all know how important gut health is and it gets shaped at such a young age. How does that impact, a child's food sensitivity? How does it impact a child's allergy development? There's so many things that stem from gut health. And if a mother has good gut health, that may lead to better gut health development for the child.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that transfer. This gets into a little bit more less sciencey, but the whole idea that the generational trauma is transferred, and then there's now we're exposed to so many different heavy metals, and there's the transfer of heavy metals. So I believe what you're saying that it's so important to have, or prior to even trying to conceive, I think a focus on improving your gut health
Yeah.
would be a great idea. And
What
that's,
happens if you have dysbiosis? So you have
yeah.
overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria that gets transferred to the child.
So I also just think that that would make your life harder during pregnancy too, because you're still struggling with your health issues. And I also think there's maybe a protective mechanism there. Maybe the body is not going to necessarily like
Yeah.
encourage the idea or the creation of a baby. So pregnancy, if you're suffering from poor gut health, which is probably why when you have gut issues, you have a lower libido, you might have a messed up menstrual cycle, or there's so many different things. Your symptoms, maybe you're bloating, so you're like, oh, really not feeling it right now. So I think like that's actually interesting to think about. The body is maybe protecting the baby or potential future baby by saying, just like in a starvation state, this is not a good time to reproduce right now. So I think that this shouldn't be something scary for a woman because I've personally had gut health issues, over the past 10 years. I think everybody has. Being on the other side of that, it sucks to be there, right? So, like, we're not trying to say you like have to have perfect gut health before you try to get pregnant. It's just something to be aware of and start making those dietary shifts to improve your overall gut, which will improve your immune system, etc. So that should be just like the foundation we're going to now talk from.
So, okay, the mother's bacteria, literal living bacteria. We're afraid of bacteria, but we're one with microbes, right? So the mother transfers microbes into the baby's gut, but then the mother also forms HMOs, human milk oligosaccharides, which then go into the baby's gut and are not digested, but they're prebiotics. So they act as food for those bacteria species. So basically, if even if there's like good bacteria going into the gut, they need food. And so these HMOs in the mother's breast milk serve as food for these bacteria species. And so obviously, this is not really talked about much, and there's not that much research, it seems like. Where there's consistency is there's about 200 different types of HMOs that a mother produces. So 200 variations. Now, the composition of those HMOs will vary based on the mother's diet, and that's not well understood.
What do you mean by composition?
So basically, certain types of oligosaccharides will better feed like bifidobacteria, beneficial bacteria, whereas other HMOs can feed more pathogenic. And so it kind of helps. So you shape the baby's gut microbiome with like the bacteria and then also the HMOs that are feeding the bacteria.
Right. So I've personally seen that there are HMO supplements on the market.
Yeah.
And I
Curious
think,
what those are made out of.
yeah, I mean, it's probably somehow derived
Yeah.
from something, maybe from a cow. I don't know.
No.
You don't think it could be? It has to be
HMOs are
from.
human milk
Oh, okay. So
oligosaccharides.
from human.
Yeah.
So that's such an interesting thing that like they've been able to try to recreate that. And I wonder if they've done that because a lot of us were not breastfed for that long. And so maybe there's this idea there that like, oh, the lack of that will now help many years later. I don't know. But what we're saying here is the
Yeah.
best route forward for our future is to just let's prioritize the beneficial
Yeah.
development of the HMOs instead of relying on a supplement.
But it seems like there's not much data on that. And one thing that's very consistent is like this is a very like preserved thing. Like the mother's body really makes sure that there's enough HMOs in the milk. However, the composition changes, like I said, and you have to think about on the mother's end. It's not just like you snap your fingers and breast milk just like comes out of nowhere, right? Like the mother has to make it in her body. It's got to pull from building blocks inside of you, you know? And if you think about what oligosaccharides are, it's complex carbohydrates. It is literal complex molecules made out of glucose compounds, building blocks. And so carbohydrates are used to form these HMOs. If someone doesn't include carbohydrates in their diet, the mother makes them. Whereas if someone does include carbohydrates in the diet, those building blocks, the glucose compounds, are used to make the HMOs. Are there consequences if if a mother doesn't include carbohydrates in her diet and she forms the HMOs inside of her through gluconeogenesis, like building the carbohydrates?
I think that to me just seems like it would scream, I'm going to tax your adrenals. Because if you're already pregnant, you're already under a lot of stress, and now you're not eating any carbohydrates, your body knows this is important for the baby. So it's going to go into overdrive to now create this through gluconeogenesis. I just can't imagine. I feel like that is and with the knowledge that giving birth is like the number one most adrenaline producing experience in a woman's life, you really, in my understanding, you really don't want to be running on adrenaline or encouraging the production of adrenaline a lot through pregnancy, because you need to be reserving that for the actual time that you give birth, and you have to recover from that. So like I 100% hear what you're saying. Like, I think potentially there is the benefit of including these carbohydrates during pregnancy in order to, what we're going to talk about today, have these beneficial HMOs naturally, as opposed to it's still natural to produce them yourself, right? But that seems stressful. What do you think about that?
Well, so what I tried to find was like, okay, so again, HMOs, the mother will always include like 200 compounds in breast milk, whatever. But then the different types of HMOs, the composition can vary. And I tried to find studies like showing, okay, a high fat, low carb diet versus a more moderate fat and higher carb approach. Does that change the types of HMOs that are in the milk? And the research is very limited.
Oh, interesting.
And so then, okay, if a child has different types of HMOs, then that means that different bacteria species in the microbiome of the newborn baby are going to be fed differently. So then a different bacterial microbiome composition will result. because different bacteria are being fed from different types of HMOs.
Okay, so we don't know yet if there is a consequence to not having carbs in the diet when you're pregnant. What we do know is it's potentially more taxing on the mother's body because she's having to produce the HMOs through gluconeogenesis.
Well, there's not, no. That's my speculation. Is
That's your
there
speculation.
consequences to requiring the body to generate the
No,
building
and
blocks?
I hear that. But so we don't know if there are consequences on the actual HMOs. What I'm saying is just like how we know that gluconeogenesis can be stressful for the human body after a period of time, it's pretty easy to come to the conclusion that it is therefore also stressful for a pregnant woman's body, especially when she's already going through so much stress to build a child.
I'm sure that I'm sure that that is one of it. What I find like most fascinating, which I like want to dive into more in the research, is like the the mother's diet. Again, the whole point of this conversation, a mother's diet impacts the composition, the breakdown, the molecules, the different types of things in the breast milk that's being delivered to the child, which then shapes the child's development and health.
For sure, but as somebody who wants to become a mother, this is the stuff I wanna know. Okay, so
Yeah.
what should I be eating? What's important?
That's something.
We're gonna get into that. No, we're gonna talk about the fat side of it, but I think since we're gonna be diving so much into the fat component of the diet in this podcast, just touching on the fact that it might be important to consider some amount of carbohydrate in the diet
Yeah.
for this reason,
Yeah.
to avoid an additional stress in the body. So, like, that's what I would wanna know if like,
Exactly. Because, like, okay, what is breast milk? Breast milk and milk in general contains all macronutrients,
yeah.
carbohydrates, fat, and protein. And it, let me see if I can pull up the exact amount, but I want to say it's only like 2 grams of protein per cup. So a cup of, and I think that this will vary too slightly, but it is a lot of carbohydrates and fat. And so does the composition of those carbs and fat vary based on the mother's diet? And I think that there's enough preliminary research to show that yes.
It does.
So
You wanna talk about that now?
yeah, well, we talked about the carbohydrate, right? So the carbohydrates, um, there's lactose, there's different types of carbohydrates, but one of them is these HMOs, these human milk oligosaccharides, and these are prebiotics. They shape the microbiome by feeding different bacteria. And so as a mother, you can produce different types of HMOs based on your diet. And where the research lacks is like the downstream implications of that, right? And then those HMOs also bind to pathogens. And so they help keep the baby healthy at a young age.
So it makes sense why they would support the immune system.
But honestly, one of the most interesting and crazy things is how much the fatty acid composition of breast milk changes. And so
Okay,
again,
hold
like,
on. So we know that there is an implication on the gut health of the child.
yeah.
So now we're talking about how the fatty acid composition of breast milk can impact the fatty acid composition of the child
So
due to the breast milk and just the human body, what's passed through.
people that follow us, a lot of what I tweet and stuff we talk about, we say the word PUFAs, right? But I think it's important to remember that all types of fats that we consume contain some amount of saturated fats, some amount of monounsaturated fats, and some amount of polyunsaturated fat, PUFAs. There's never one single. It's always a combination. But where different types of fats vary is the ratio of those. So this is something that I like to try to help people understand is like some foods have a higher saturated to unsaturated fat ratio. And so that's going to be things like tallow and beef fat and butter, dairy. And then other items are going to have higher unsaturated fat ratios because they're higher in PUFAs and MUFAs. And that's going to be, like seed oils and nuts and seeds. And so obviously the types of fat that you consume in your diet impacts the types of fat inside humans. And we have seen a huge change in the fatty acid breakdown of humans. So if you were to look at the percentage, like look at a pie chart, the percentage of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fat over the last 100 years, we used to be a lot more saturated. We've become more unsaturated. So the levels of saturated fat in our bodies have dropped, and the level of mono and PUFAs have risen. We are more unsaturated.
We've been poofed.
We've been PUFAd. And another conversation for another day. MUFA levels have risen as well, but we'll dive into more PUFAs today. So
yeah. So, okay, can you briefly explain linoleic acid before we start talking about that?
the linoleic acid is an omega-6 PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid, and it is very high in seed oils, nuts, and also in a lot of conventional chicken and pork because their diets are high in PUFAs, which means their tissue that we then consume is higher in PUFAs. And so that's very telling for humans because we're very similar to chickens and pigs in terms of we're monogastric animals. So the types of fat that we consume impacts the types of fat inside of us.
For sure. Okay.
And so we've seen a huge rise in omega-6 linoleic acid and just PUFA consumption in general. And so you can imagine, we've seen butter, dairy, all of those types of fats go down because
Tallow.
plant-based milk is, the big hip thing these days. And then we've seen plant-based milk and nuts and seeds and vegetable oils rise. And so we used to eat diets that were higher in saturated fat to unsaturated fat. And now our diets are significantly higher in unsaturated fats to saturated fat.
I would say that vegetable oils is the most concerning and
100%.
alarming component because most people don't know that they're eating it.
Yeah.
When it's just in every single packaged item, it's cooked at every single restaurant. It's unfortunate, but that's our reality. So let's dive into some of these studies that show the implications of this. So
Similar to what we were talking about, the oligosaccharides.
yeah,
Like in breast milk, it contains fat. Like it contains a decent amount of fat in it. And you don't just snap your fingers and the breast milk has fat.
right. And it's not like the breast milk fat has stayed consistent like hundreds of generations ago because, like you said, the mother's body is producing this from what's there.
That's what I'm getting to.
Right. So like when you said snap your fingers, I was like, it's not just you snap your fingers and it like outpours the most perfect breast milk.
No, it's pulling from your body
Yeah.
what you have inside of you.
Yeah. Can I say something before we get into this?
Of course.
Okay. To not be insensitive because neither Ashley and I have had a child yet.
Yeah.
And what we're going to be talking about is like kind of very alarming in many ways as far as child development. This is not to blame anybody or make anybody feel like they've done a disservice to their child. So many of us have been eating vegetable oils since we were little.
We are just having a conversation.
Right. And this conversation is strictly for people who either want to get some answers maybe, or two, who are in the process of potentially thinking about having a child in the next few years or really want to turn their health around and make sure that their baby is healthy too, which is the camp that I fall in. And that's what we're talking about. It's not to say that like what's already been done is some sort of mistake. It's not. Every child born is beautiful.
No, not shaming anyone. I don't want to make anyone feel bad.
Right. So, yeah. So, okay. The most alarming thing for breast milk to me is the linoleic acid composition and the implication that it can have on the development. So this
is a figure, and I'll try to show it to the camera, but essentially it shows the year on the x-axis and then the percentage of total fatty acids on the y-axis.
This is the change in the human diet?
This is the change in the amount in human breast milk.
Oh, okay. So this is the breast milk chart.
In the early 1900s, linoleic acid and omega-6 PUFA was about 5%. In 1930, it was at 5% of total fatty acids. And in 2010, there's some data showing above 20%. And so that was 2010, and now it's 2025. So basically, it's a general increase. So it's rising. And there's also been a huge change in the types of fat that we're consuming in our diet too.
Yeah. And so, okay, one of the alarming things was the delayed development. So it says that both psychomotor and mental delays by the time the infant is just 6 months old as a consequence of the mother having a diet higher in linoleic acid and therefore the breast milk. And then another thing to dive into is the rates of autism and how it's correlated with this chart that you basically just showed us.
Yeah. And I wrote an article about this in the past. And again, just not putting anyone to shame, or if anyone has, autistic members of their family, like, it's not saying that this is the only reason, but is this a contributing factor? There's an interesting research study that was published July of 2024 titled Arachidonic Acid-Derived Dihydral Fatty Acids in Neonatal Cord Blood Relate Symptoms of Autism Spectrum Disorders and Social Adaptive Functioning. It's an HBC study. And so it showed that the presence of metabolic byproducts of PUFA breakdown in the umbilical cord fluid was linked to severity of autism's symptoms in children. So PUFAs, the reason that they cause so much problems in the body is they're unstable because they have double bonds, and those can be oxidized through enzymatic oxidation or non-enzymatic oxidation, and the byproducts of that oxidation can cause damage throughout the body. And I like to think of it like a car crash. So if there's a car crash, then there's like debris that fly everywhere. So it basically showing that the breakdown products of oxidation of PUFAs, there was more of those in the umbilical cord fluid, and that linked to severity of autism. So again, is it the only cause of autism? No. There's several reasons, but is it contributing to some sort of problems with the development of the child? I don't know.
Yeah. And so like you said before, this has to do with the fatty acid composition of the mother. So the mother's diet leading up to the point of becoming pregnant is important. And then also in the colostrum and in the breast milk, the fatty acid composition in that as well. What we're continuing to feed to the child once they've been birthed. They're birthed.
Yeah. If we think of a flow, so the flow would be like what the mother is eating up to the point where she gets pregnant, because the fatty acid composition inside of you, it takes a while.
Isn't it like 4 years to
The half-life of linoleic acid is like 2 years. And so it takes a bit to shift your fatty acid composition. And it's not just diet. There's also like metabolic, basically the state of your metabolism will also impact this too, because the state of your metabolism impacts various enzymes that are converting saturated fats in your body into unsaturated fats. And so the state of your metabolism and what you're eating will impact your fatty acid composition. Then
So why would the body be converting any saturated to unsaturated, or is that kind of like
that's through an SCD1?
Okay.
And it's in my view, it's a adaptation from the body to preserve energy. So when they do that, it will downregulate metabolism, which if a body is like, okay, we don't have enough energy,
I see.
we need to downregulate
So
things.
just like how humans
Like squirrels
historically
hibernating.
have needed to hibernate, there's periods where there's less food, etc. So you PUFA yourself.
Yeah.
But so in a sense, for a higher metabolism, you would therefore want to reduce SCD1 or blunt it or block it. However, what would be the right term?
So that gets regulated by the state of your metabolism. Like you can't take, like, that's just one of the things.
But improving your metabolism therefore would lower SCD1.
Yeah, it will. So for example, some of the highest metabolic rates reported, and this is information that I've learned from Brad Marshall, Fire in a Bottle. Some of the highest metabolic rates reported had very saturated body fat tissues. And that's because the enzymes in their body aren't taking that saturated fat and MUFAing it or PUFAing it. So converting it into unsaturated fats. So there's like metabolic implications and then also dietary fat implications, but your dietary fat choices impact your metabolism. So it's like all clumped in.
You know, it'd be interesting too if they were to take those people and then look at the cognitive abilities too, since that's what we're talking about here, is the correlation between, I don't know, their skills in that area to how high their metabolism is. And when you have a high metabolism, I mean, you have, it's almost like you just have a little bit more blood flow going to the brain, like you just are on a little bit more. And so it would make sense. It doesn't mean that the one that has lower metabolism is inherently stupid. It just means that there's potentially a slower, everything's moving slower.
Your brain uses up most of your body's energy. Like a significant percentage of your energy.
So if no energy,
produce more systemic energy, then your brain gets more energy.
Yeah, the whole concept of brain fog.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So
the mother's body fat composition then impacts, clearly, there's data showing this, clearly impacts the fatty acid composition of the breast milk that she produces for the child. So then the child is exposed to various levels of PUFAs from the start. And I think that how do you study these types? How can you conduct research studies on 3 generations? It's very hard, right? Because your grandma's diet then impacted your mother's fatty acid composition, which then impacts your fatty acid composition. There's a lot of layers here that makes it really complicated and
Yeah.
difficult to investigate.
Yeah.
But what are the consequences of a child that's exposed to more PUFAs and is made up of more PUFAs?
Right. Well, this here, it says that babies with higher linoleic acid levels in breast milk may have similar cognitive and motor scores as non-breastfed babies. And so we've been told, how important it is to try to breastfeed your child. Again, no shame if you didn't, no shame if you can't. I don't know that I was breastfed that long. I don't know. So that is significant though, because it's almost like comparing the high linoleic acid breastfed to a formula in a sense because of the fatty acid composition that's in formulas because they use vegetable oils and then the resulting impact on the child. I think that's important to know and alarming. And then also that there's these follow-up studies too showing that it's not just a temporary thing. It's also that children with higher linoleic acid levels in breast milk show lower cognitive scores at age 15. So setting up your child for success over a lifetime, not just the first few years of development. Yeah, and that's why this conversation is happening because for me to think about this too, what I'm eating right now really matters as I'm preparing to build a baby in my body and then also just like care for that baby and give it the nutrients and the vital fatty acids it needs to be successful in life and have the best chance, especially in the world we live in. Oh my gosh, like at some point that baby will be bombarded with vegetable oils unless things significantly change. And so might as well set them up for success if possible. Yeah.
Yeah, like what the mother eats impacts her fatty acid composition, which impacts the fatty acid composition of the breast milk, which
Yeah.
impacts the fatty acid composition of the child. And then what the child eats after having breast milk then continues to impact it.
Yeah.
And we're just made up differently than our great great grandparents. And
Yeah.
I think we're just now seeing the consequences of this
Oh,
because this is like generational things.
yeah. I mean, okay. So, yeah, we always poo poo on America, but this is a global concern. Studies show that this is consistent across 28 different countries that high linoleic acid in breast milk is linked to lower cognitive abilities, lower test scores. And this study was controlling even the wealth and the parental education. So, those are obviously contributing factors to how somebody would score on a test.
Yeah.
And I think that all that aside and just looking at the fact that there was a higher percent linoleic acid in the breast milk of the lower scores is very significant. It's very telling and it's very sad too to know.
And I think we always talk about what went up, but it's a you can only have a certain amount. And so for something to go up, something else has to go down. And I don't know the answer to this, but I'm fairly confident that whenever linoleic acid or PUFAs rise, it's at the expense of beneficial saturated fats such as stearic acid. And now we're learning about the essentiality of odd chain saturated fats, C15-0, and how that improves longevity and metabolism. And if your breast milk has lower amounts of those, you don't have as beneficial building blocks as, a more natural ancestral breast milk composition.
I mean, that makes sense. It seems like the human body does one thing like stagnantly. It controls that there's carbs and there's fat in the breast milk.
Yeah.
So if we have a controlled amount or a relatively controlled amount of fat in the breast milk, if there's going to be higher PUFA, there's going to be lower saturated fat. So like, yeah, the
That's
ratio will
just like
change.
literal. If
Yeah,
for something to go up, something else has to go down.
correct. So I think you're right. But we missed this though. But so this says here 30% of linoleic acid in breast milk comes from the mother's diet. 70% comes from the stored body fat. So,
Wow.
yeah, so what you've eaten before is significantly important.
70%
Yeah,
comes from.
and your body suit is very important. And what you said earlier that the fat stores have a half-life of 2 years, so 4 years in total to switch or change. And that would likely require a very dedicated commitment to eating lower PUFA and higher saturated fat, or just in general, reducing your fat intake and focusing more on carbohydrates is an example of how you could do this. that is something that is so alarming to me because that is hard.
I get that. Hold on.
Yeah.
70% of the fat in breast milk is resulting from the fat source of the mother.
That's
And
what this says.
and
Yeah, the study.
30% of the fat stores is coming from the mother's diet.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting because it's showing how the body is balancing feeding the mother while also feeding the child at the same time. And it chooses to pull more of the fat from the mother's stores to feed the child. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And then more of the mother's fat diet feeds her. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I think so many people are always talking about, build up your mineral stores, build up all these different things because your body is going to become depleted. Like you're not just like eating actually this makes a lot of sense historically too if you think about it because in the past as humans evolved there wasn't always a grocery store, there wasn't always a plethora of food. So let's say that the diet had to reduce for a period of time. Okay, yeah, we're going to just continue to pull from the mother's body, right? So it's not necessarily what's coming in, it's what's already there. Because obviously it's going to prioritize continuing to keep this baby alive.
And you are what you eat. So
Yeah.
what is there is shaped by your diet.
Yeah. Just going through, I don't want to miss anything. So you showed that chart of the um, linoleic acid in the breast milk, and I think that you could easily pull up a similar chart of the rise in PUFAs in the human diet.
Yep.
So it's just this trend going up, right?
Yep.
And so when we were talking about cognitive delays and autism, we failed to mention that the current stat, or from what I understand, is that 1 in 36 children in the US are diagnosed with autism, and that has risen. That is not consistent with the past at all.
And the studies also demonstrate that while we've improved our ability to diagnose autism, that significant rise in autism rates can't be explained by just the improved testing.
Right.
There's diet reasons for this.
Diet, environment, it's not just diet, but
Yeah.
this
This plays a
seems
role.
important. Yeah. Do you wanna go into um, the metabolic byproducts, the breakdown byproducts of PUFAs? I cannot pronounce this word, and I'm gonna have you do it.
What's the
The
word?
dihydrogenase thing.
No, this is what I talked about earlier. The PUFAs are there's a few reasons why they cause like metabolic problems. So polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, they hinder your ability to properly burn carbohydrates. So they're, quote, a dirty fuel. And so after a meal, like you're supposed to burn carbs first. If you've got a mixed meal, you're supposed to burn carbs first. Carbohydrates burn in the flame, or fat burns in the flame of carbohydrates. And so you're supposed to burn carbs first, and then you tap into fat in between meals. Polyunsaturated fats burn first, and so they interfere with carbohydrate metabolism. They damage and block and downregulate a number of very important metabolic machinery, such as cytochrome C oxidase, which is an important enzyme in the electron transport chain that allows you to properly burn carbohydrates. So polyunsaturated fatty acids cause metabolic problems. So they're one of the reasons why we're seeing a downregulation in our metabolism across the country. But they don't just cause metabolic problems, they also cause damage. Like they're unstable compounds. So this whole, oxidation is the basically breakdown of PUFAs, and in the process of that, they form these very toxic compounds. Like I said, the car crash, right? So you've got shards everywhere that's damaging compounds all over the body. And so never before have we had this much PUFA inside of us. And as a result, we also are seeing higher levels of these lipid peroxidation products. And so there's various ones. There's MDA, HNE, like a ton of different types and classifications. But, look up like their association and their relation with diabetes and all these things. Like, of course, they're literally causing damage all over the body. So of course they're going to have that has some implication. So lipid peroxidation products and Alzheimer's is a big issue. And so if you are made up of more PUFAs, your body mobilizes your fat stores throughout the day to produce energy. You don't just make energy from the food that you're consuming. I think that energy production is a lot more like dynamic than people think. So the body is constantly like pulling from our fat stores, putting stuff in our fat stores. Like it's a lot more dynamic. And so if your body is like constantly pulling PUFAs, there's implications to that as well.
Would you say it's like putting really low quality, the wrong type of gas in a car?
Yeah, and we don't have generations like I'm not. No one here is saying like you should eat a really high fat diet, right? But our ancestors definitely ate more like of a mixed diet, and there's generations of a higher saturated approach, right? Dairy. We've been consuming dairy for 7,000 years. Dairy is very high in saturated fat, very low in PUFA. Beef, all these very like traditional fats that have sustained generations, and then boom, early 1900s, we see this huge change in our food system, massive. Never before have we seen this flip in dietary fat choices as much as we have.
What you wrote here is that linoleic acid makes up over 25% of the daily calorie of an average person today.
It used to be 1 to 2%.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
25% of your calories is a lot.
Let's acknowledge that people are now consuming more fat, more calories. Like that is an issue too. People are over consuming for their needs, which is very easy to do.
Not necessarily calories.
Processed food.
Yeah.
And food abundance, but there also is data showing we've seen a downregulation of our BMR, our basal metabolic rates, where just sitting here, we burn less calories than our ancestors.
Right. But as we've talked about in the Minnesota starvation experiment from last season of the podcast, it's not necessarily that we're consuming more leading to the obesity epidemic and stuff. It's that our metabolisms have lowered significantly. Yes, there's people who are still overeating.
It's a combination of
It's both. A combination because we are getting by with less fuel these days, which some people in the longevity camps say that that's optimal, right?
That is an outdated metabolism rate of living theory.
Either way, I don't want to be in hibernation for my whole life. So okay, so if linoleic acid is making up 25% of the daily calories, we also have to consider that it's not just coming from the vegetable oils or the pure, what we know as sources of PUFAs, like nuts and seeds. It is also coming from the chickens and the pigs and the way that we are changing their feed, so including more items higher in PUFA. And therefore, the fat in those animals is now higher in PUFA. So I know this is what Nourish is basically founded on.
Nourish is our Nourish Food Club. We are going back to ancestral, traditional ways of food preparation, standing against the modern confinement industrial food complex, going back to the good old days. So we produce a low PUFA food system.
Yes. And I remember this one post that you shared about the fatty acid composition, and you compared it from pork fed a high PUFA diet, which is a standard diet, right, to vegetable oil. Can you tell me about that?
So there's a number of things that have changed in our food system, like swapping butter for vegetable oil. But we've also very significantly changed what chickens and pigs are eating and how they're raised. So a chicken or a pig eating outside on pasture, they still require feed, supplemental feed, but they're also getting, grasses and bugs and various things. Now, if you stuff animals into a confinement building, all they get is the feed, right? And so their feed is higher in PUFAs, higher in linoleic acid, corn, soy, vegetable oil, and this thing called dried distiller grains, which is no good, very high in PUFA.
No good.
So we've drastically changed the types of fat that they're consuming, and that's led to a huge increase in the PUFA concentration of conventional pork and chicken. And there's one study that documented that pigs fed dried distiller grains and, soybeans and corn and the standard, they have the same fatty acid composition as canola oil.
That's the vegetable oil that we're
so
high in linoleic acid.
Yeah. And so even the food system is PUFAing us. It's UFAing us. UFAing. We're getting more unsaturated because of the food system. Like the food system has changed drastically, and that's leading to a change in the types of fats that we're consuming, which is impacting the types of fat inside of us, which is impacting the fatty acid composition of the next generation.
And I know you said we don't have data for next generations yet, but I would say that things are getting pretty weird. They're getting a little too buck wild for me. I'm a little bit like way confused.
Chronic diseases are on the rise.
Yeah, that's
obesity is on the
just
rise.
factual.
There's so many things that are on the rise, even though we have the best technology in the world, right? But
it's on the rise. And you know what's funny? They're just on the rise. That makes me think of a chart you showed. Like everything's just on the rise along with that one.
going up.
Yeah.
And again, we are not experts in these things, but I really enjoy going through the literature and finding these studies. And honestly, the historical precedents, looking at what our ancestors did and that sustained generations before them, what we're doing now doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
Makes literal no sense. And
it makes sense to the lobbyists and the leaders of the big ag and pharmaceutical companies because they get in more money.
Statins are the most profitable medicine that humans have ever created, and they only work if you believe that cholesterol is bad. And so, what lowers cholesterol? PUFAs. So they very much like go hand in hand.
Well, okay, but that's a whole other topic because you don't want super high cholesterol indicating potentially impaired thyroid function, but there's nuance there.
I think so the reason that I wanted to talk about this today is, one, I'm excited to help with Sarah and Brandon's future child and be the best auntie.
Children.
And I think that it's an important thing for people our age to start thinking about if they're wanting to have children. I want to have children one day, and how do I get my body fat in the best composition that I can? You gotta
un-PUFA yourself
right now to be prepared for that. And another reason why we talk about this is like we are so passionate about this, and we're trying to do what we can to make this change by building Nourish, because it's not everyone's fault, right? Like the food system is hard to navigate. It's a nightmare. And hopefully, the rest of the season and on our channels, we can share more about, strategies to help someone get themselves ready for success. I guess
that's the theme of this series almost. Because it's so relevant. And like you said, like it's not anybody's fault. It's so tough because unless you fall into like the rabbit hole of this topic, you aren't really exposed to it. And even the like healthier, like I'm using bunny ears and my fingers, the healthier food items in the health food stores, so people kind of are still going to rely on those products. Like let's say it's like a gluten-free, healthier graham cracker. There's like a 9 out of 10 chance. There's almost a 9.9 out of 10 chance that is using vegetable oil for that product.
And organic soybean oil has the same PUFA concentration as non-organic soybean oil. Organic labeling doesn't change the PUFA.
Right. And like, okay, we can keep going on that. Gluten-free doesn't automatically mean it's better. It's so frustrating. Sourdough. We were at Aldi the other day and we were going, we needed a bell pepper, single one.
For a video. And it was on the way home from the gym.
So we just like, with little kids in a candy store, just start looking around and we saw the sourdough packages that they have. And it's like, ooh, sourdough. Great. Let's look at it. What was in it?
There was, of course, enriched flour, which is a government oopsie. There was yeast and dyes and gums, and it's just like, this is not sourdough
There was
bread.
Most likely vegetable oil too, because they stuff it into everything.
And so if someone doesn't have time to prepare food from scratch and they rely more on like processed food or like prepared food, it's going to be really hard. And that is something that I'm so grateful.
There are more options coming out though, like that are using coconut oil, which is a good one. That's highly saturated, but it is still hard to navigate. And that's why sometimes it's best to just do simplicity, relying on the whole food source. So that way there's not the ingredient list that could potentially sneak in the vegetable oil. But all that aside, something that this conversation made me think about is, okay, so we said that the fatty acid composition in the breast milk comes 70% from the woman's body fat stores, 30% from what she's eating. What about the man?
Oh, that's something I don't know.
Okay, so what I do know is that obviously there are things that impact the male's fertility, and that male fertility is actually a huge thing. It's not all the ladies' fault.
I wrote an article about that.
Yes, that's why I know it. But I just think like if there could be more information about this, but what makes me wonder if it doesn't necessarily impact breast milk is because of the 70-30 that equals 100, right? So like it almost seems like,
Of course, the male doesn't impact the breast milk.
yes, but as far as like the developmental side of it, I understand that the baby is being made inside the woman with the tissues, but what about the sperm
Yes.
impacts the development of the child too? There has to be something.
Very interesting. We'll
Yeah.
dive in.
Yeah.
We'll dive into the literature and see
And
what's out
you
there.
know who I'd love to be on the podcast for that?
Brandon.
My husband, Brandon. So if you guys want him on the podcast, you're gonna have to like show up with picket forks and make him get in here. But I think that would be really fun, like what he thinks about all this, how he's changed his nutrition over the last few years that we've been together, and does he even think, sometimes it's really hard for somebody who hasn't gone through a significant health challenge to care. And of course, that's our background. That's where we came from, and that's most of the listeners. But having a spouse who hasn't, and you're like, you are the tin foil hat person and you sound crazy all the time. I get you.
Maybe it was helpful that both of us were crazy.
I
So then
get
he was
you.
like, okay, I guess there's two.
Yeah. Yeah. But then he got involved with Nourish. He saw how many customers have been impacted by our food. Oh my God, I can eat this now.
Very vivid memories of Brandon going out to dinner with his friends.
Yeah.
And coming home and be like, oh, I feel so sick.
Yes. So after he started eating, like he started learning from what we're doing and eating way less PUFA. So the goal for him is just don't eat the vegetable oils. He still swaps up when he goes out to eat and stuff. It's fine. But as soon as he started eating less vegetable oils and his diet was, good healthy carbs and saturated fats from grass-fed meats and our milk.
He's a raw milk.
Yeah, he just
connoisseur.
brings home around a gallon of raw milk all day.
I love that for him.
He gets really bummed out when there's not any, but he drinks the raw milk so he can eat my homemade brownies. I'm not gonna lie, but those are made with butter, so it's fine. Anyway, like you said, when he started to switch his diet over and he would go out to eat with his friends, he would come home and feel horrible. Stomach issues, just feeling awful. This still happens because he still eats out like on rare occasions. But let's say we go to Easter or Christmas, he'll feel horrible. And it's just like, I'm at the point because I've gone through health scares where I'm like, I am not putting my body through that. And therefore I'm simply not going to eat it. I don't want it. I don't desire it. It's fine. I'm good. My future baby's good, but he hasn't had that complication. And therefore, I understand that this could be a really tough thing for a couple who is not on the same page, right? So hopefully, let's bring in a male's perspective eventually and start looking into the male side too. So, ladies, you can send something to your husbands.
Yep. Okay, so let's wrap up this conversation. So first, we wanted to just talk about it because it gets people thinking. And I think it's an important conversation that not enough people are having, that as a mother, you can change the composition of your breast milk, the types of bacteria species that you give into your baby, the types of HMOs that are feeding the bacteria in your child's gut, which then shapes the gut microbiome and blocks pathogens. And it also changes the fatty acid composition of your breast milk, which is building your child. Because we're made up of fat. We have fat around our body, right? So my biggest takeaway, because I'm in a position where I really want to be paying attention to this because I'm older. And so I want to set myself up for success for having a future child. So and this is something I do naturally, but I think if someone hasn't been doing this, paying attention to the amount and the types of fat that you're consuming. Because if you're consuming 60 grams of fat in your diet daily, that can vary based on what your choices are. Like Kentucky Fried Chicken, that's going to have a ton of seed oils in it, high PUFA, oat milk, like all these things are going to have a higher PUFA percentage. So the total amount of fat that you're consuming and the types of fat that you're consuming. And you can log these things into Chronometer and kind of assess and see where is how much PUFA am I consuming dietarily. I think it's just something to just pay attention to.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So Ashley told me this super interesting thing the other day that cows are naturally horned. Okay. So you told me that
meaning they have horns. Cows naturally
they have horns. So you told me that in the most optimal scenario, cows do not get dehorned. right? Because their detoxification system potentially, it's not like we don't know this for sure, potentially flows through their horns. So the reason I bring this up is because that obviously just benefits the cow's health, right? Like, let's just have healthier cows. But the reason I bring this up is if your lymphatic system as a human or your detoxification system is impaired, I wonder the implications on the amount of toxins or something coming out in your breast milk.
Interesting. I have
I
no
would
idea.
love to see a study on that.
Ooh, okay, yeah, let's dive in.
Cool.
Like, again, imagine that the body is pretty protective of what goes into the milk, but
For sure. But at the same time, like,
you've got to block.
when that's the raw material, and yes, it's protective, but when have we ever been exposed to this much crap?
Yeah. All right. Well,
Oh, no, sorry. Real quick. We know that the plastics is an issue. That is passed down.
Yeah.
So we know this is a thing.
Yeah.
So just basically, it's very hard.
So we do not have a podcast sponsor, but if you are interested in becoming a part of our low PUFA food system that we are building at Nourish Food Club, we aren't accepting new members right at this point, but if you want to join the wait list to be notified when we are opening up spots, and that's for low PUFA eggs, low PUFA chicken, low PUFA pork, our raw dairy cosmetics, 100% grass-fed ground beef,
Sourdough,
traditional sourdough,
pure
like
honey,
real sourdough,
maple syrup,
Yep.
etc.
Lots of stuff.
Dog food.
Join the link for the waitlist in the description below, and hopefully you can be a part of our low PUFA food system one day.
Dog food.
And
we
dog
have
food.
not even talked about the impacts on dogs.
Yep.
So much to talk about, you guys. I can't wait.
Fun podcast season ahead, and thanks guys for joining. And until next time, stay rooted in resilience.